well, good afternoon to the people who are in the same time zone as we are. I think good morning and good evening to others. So I'm Katrien de Scheemaker, sitting in Wageningen in the Netherlands, working for Wageningen University. And I'm presenting today this webinar on livestock modeling, together with my colleague Mink Zijlstra, who's working also here in Wageningen, and with Ramilan. I will not try to pronounce his second name. Ramilan is also online. He joins us from India, and Ramilan is working with ICRISAT. Now, this presentation is based on a lot of contributions from the CLIP team, who are also online listening in together with Sabine Homan. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this first webinar on livestock modeling. And today is really an introduction. It's really an introduction to livestock modeling in the context of smallholder mixed systems. And we'll be looking at some of the experiences within the CLIP team in phase 1. Now, before we start, just a few housekeeping issues. I would like to remind everybody to mute their microphones if you're not speaking. There is always a bit of background noise, people typing, people talking to others. So please don't forget to mute, that will help. Secondly, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box. Like that, Shari, who will be following everything that appears in the chat box, she can compile the questions, and then later on we can deal with them. Shari will interrupt me if there is a question that is really specific to something on the slide we're looking at the moment, and otherwise we will have some time at the end of the webinar to go through the more general questions. Okay, so let's get started. So a bit of an introduction. In AgMIP phase 1, there was actually one team, the CLIP team, which is working in Southern Africa, that included livestock modeling in their integrated analysis. And now that we're moving into phase 2, more and more teams have expressed an interest to introduce livestock and include it in their integrated analyses. And well, and because of that, we are we have been thinking about how we can support those new teams in terms of their efforts in livestock modeling. And so we are basically a group of 3 people, the 3 people that I already mentioned, Ramilan, Mink, and myself, who are now, well, part of AgMIP phase 2 to provide some support for the teams that now will include livestock. As mentioned, Ramilan is an ICRISAT staff member. He is actually a team member of the South India team. And apart from that, he's also the AgMIP resource person for the West Africa team. So he's really wearing different hats. Mink is working at Wageningen University, and he has recently become a team member of the CLIP team in Southern Africa to really support us with the livestock modeling. And then myself, I'm also an AgMIP resource person, an ARP with the CLIP team. And so we are here to help you, to try and help you, of course not to do the work for you. And the way we want to try and help you is by, well, first of all, with these webinars. So we have 2 webinars, today and in 2 weeks. And then we'll have some livestock sessions also during the Vikfalls workshop at the end of the month. And in those sessions, we'll go into a lot more detail on the livestock modeling, and we'll come with software and with exercises that will help you perform these analyses. And then we'll also include some livestock issues in the AgMIP protocols. With respect to the webinars, as I said, we have two. Today is really an introduction, and it's more generic about crop livestock systems, about climate change impacts on livestock within these systems, and about learning from the CLIP-1 experiences. Then in 2 weeks' time, we will go into the more technical details of livestock modeling with a model called LiveSim. And we'll try to give you an introduction to the model, to the data requirements, and to the model setup. So that's for within 2 weeks. And well, in terms of overall objectives of these webinars, they are basically targeting the crop livestock modelers and other interested people. Perhaps some economists are also listening in. And the objective of the webinars is really to prepare ourselves for the work in phase 2 and to also get you up to speed with what to bring to the VicFols workshop and what to expect from that workshop in order to really come prepared so that we don't lose time the first day of the workshop. But we'll talk about those details in the next webinar. So for this webinar, just a brief overview of what we will be talking about. We'll talk first about, well, as I said, some general characteristics of crop livestock systems. That is about, well, the components, the interactions between components of these systems, some of the peculiarities of these systems. And, well, I think for many of you, those general characteristics, you might know them. It might not be very new, but I think it's still good to have them listed so that we all start from the same page. We'll then talk about climate change effects on livestock components. That means trying to give you an overview of what we know and what we don't know yet about those effects. And then we will look at the concrete example of the CLIP project. We'll look at the approach we took in phase 1 to include livestock in our assessments. And we'll look at some of the results that we've been able to obtain with that approach. And then we'll end with some results on the rangeland modeling that was conducted within CLIP-1 by one of the students, Trinity, who was and is part of our project. So that's the content of today. So well, let's get started. So we're starting with the general characteristics of crop livestock systems, and this, I think by now, is a very famous picture. It's a drawing by Amina, the daughter of Sabine, who is now the PI of the project. And that drawing basically summarizes what crop livestock systems are all about and the different components and interactions between these components. So we have the livestock, different types of livestock here, the different crops that farmers may grow, the manure that goes from the livestock to the crops, the stover or the crop residues that go from the crops to the livestock as feed, and then importantly also the pastures where the livestock is grazing. Now I'll bring up just another picture that shows you basically the same. This is a picture that we often use here in Wageningen within our group to show the different components of mixed systems and to also illustrate that that the fields that people have are not all the same, even though they might be growing the same crop. You might have a maize field that receives more fertilizer and more manure, perhaps this one that is closer to the homestead, than a maize field further away that doesn't receive much inputs and therefore provides or produces a lower yield. Now, when we bring in animals into the system, the picture starts to become a little bit more complex because we have animals roaming around. Some people might keep them in a kraal or in a stall, and then the manure that is produced will go, or at least part of it, will go back to the crops. As you see, the livestock, they graze in the rangelands, but it's not only the livestock of this farm that graze in the rangelands, but also the livestock from other farmers that might be grazing exactly the same rangelands in the village. And with that, it's really important where we put the boundaries of our system, because if we want to look at how these crop livestock systems perform, we cannot put the boundary of our system just around the fields, because then we're missing a lot of the interactions that play a role in these crop livestock systems. When we look at the farm, we really have to include the different fields that form the farming system, as well as the animals, as well as actually the part of the rangeland that is used by these animals. And if we really want to make the picture complete, we also have to include actually the livestock of other farmers who are also grazing the same rangelands. And then, of course, the whole thing becomes quite complicated. So deciding on where we put our boundaries is very important and not always very straightforward. So I think that's an important point that I wanted to make, and that we have to keep in mind as we do our analyses. Okay, so when we talk about the interactions between crop and livestock, there's a few important ones to mention, and I've listed them here. So first of all, crop residues are used as livestock feed. So that is going from the crops to the livestock. Then from the livestock to the crops, we have manure that is used as organic fertilizer. And then thirdly, the livestock that is used for plowing. And that is also quite important because it influences the timeliness of sowing, for example. So people with enough cattle, they will be able to plow and sow on time, whereas people who have little cattle, they might be facing delays in planting. Apart from that, people also sell livestock to buy inputs that they then use on their crops, and well, they keep livestock as a buffer against risk, as crop production is often much more risky than livestock production. Looking then at the importance of crop livestock systems, well, this map shows you the geographic spread across vast areas on the globe. We're focusing here on the regions that are also part of the AgMIP project. So parts in sub-Saharan Africa where mixed rain-fed systems are very important, and then parts of South Asia where again mixed rain-fed, but also very many mixed irrigated systems are present. And indeed, you can see that there is much more purple colors than in South Asia than in Africa, where everything is basically rain-fed. So, okay, crop livestock systems cover a big area. It's also true that the majority of livestock keeping households combine livestock keeping with crop production, and that crop livestock systems are actually responsible for the largest share of meat and milk production in the tropics, and they provide a livelihood of really millions of poor farmers. So I think the importance of the mixed systems is beyond question, and so it is important that we take them into account in our analyses. Okay, let's then come to a few of the important characteristics of these systems. And one of them is the multifunctionality of the livestock herds, and that is something that is especially true in the African context, where animals are often or almost always not just kept for meat and milk production, but more importantly for these other functions, such as the crop supporting functions in terms of manure, in terms of draft power. Also, the capital and insurance functions are super important, the socio-cultural functions as well. And so basically in many of the systems that we study, you could say that meat and milk are just so-called byproducts. And as a result of that, many farmers, they will try to maximize their herd sizes instead of maximizing productivity in terms of meat and milk. So they prefer to keep more animals, even if those animals are then performing at a lower level of productivity. And this, of course, leads often to overstocking, sometimes, or quite often or regularly, to degradation of the natural resources and the grazing lands, and further down the road to feed gaps as well. And we'll talk about these feed gaps in a minute. Okay, another important characteristic relates to the feed composition in mixed crop livestock systems, or the diet composition. And the figures I'm showing here, they come from a paper by Diego Valbuena and colleagues that was published in Agricultural Systems this year. And this data draws from a study called the System-Wide Livestock Program or Project, where they brought together information from a range of sites, from, again, quite relevant for AgMIP, from India and Bangladesh, and then various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And actually our Zimbabwe site, Nkai, was also part of this study. And the household data that we've been using in our project, they actually come from this study. Now, what I wanted to really highlight with this figure is that the feed composition varies, of course, between those different systems, but that first of all, crop residues usually play a very important role. In some systems, perhaps a bit less, especially where crop intensification and livestock feed demand are very low. But overall, the crop residue proportion in the diet ranges from 10 to 60%. But the problem is that crop residues are often of low feed quality, as you probably know very well. Then, when it comes to grazing, the second component in the feed, in the livestock diet, grasses they provide between 0 and 90% of the diet. And the problem there is that we are dealing with large seasonal fluctuations, both in quantity and in quality. And then finally, fodder crops and concentrates. Those are the white and the dark gray colors in the figure. They often provide, or they are often much less important. If we look, for example, at Nkai for Zimbabwe, we see that fodder crops and concentrates are not even appearing. So in Nkai, livestock really depend on low quality crop residues and on the grazing lands. So that is feed composition. Let's move then to feed gaps. I have two graphs to illustrate feed gaps. One comes from Ethiopia, where there are severe shortages, especially before the start of the rainy season. And that is not specific to Ethiopia. It is something that is quite common throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And we see also that indeed, again here, crop residues, they provide the largest share of the diet. And the problem here is that they are indeed of low quality. And so not only do we have problems in terms of feed quantity, we also rely on low quality feed sources in the dry season in these areas. The same or a similar problem is found in Zimbabwe, in Nkai, our study site for the CLIP project. And these figures, they come from Patricia Masikati's PhD thesis, where she compares the feed demand and supply for two types of households, people with few cattle and people with more cattle. In the black line, you see the supply of freshly grown grasses. And you see that that goes down quite quickly from April, May, and stays quite low. It stays below the demand until the end of November, basically. And then we have supply with carryover, so that is not the fresh but the dried grasses that can still be consumed by the livestock. But also those, they go down, and so you see that there's an important feed gap from July up to November, let's say. And so in these months, again, the farmers, they rely heavily on crop residues to keep their animals alive. Okay, so I think so far a brief overview of some important characteristics of crop livestock systems, especially with respect to the multifunctionality of the herd, the feed composition, and the feed gaps. I think those are three very important elements that will come back in the way we also deal with these systems in our modeling exercises. So I move on then to the effects of climate change on crop livestock systems. So through changes in temperature, precipitation, and CO2 concentrations, we can expect changes in three components of our system: in the crop component, in the livestock component, and in the rangeland component, or the pasture component. Now, when we look at the crops, we're talking about changes in biomass production, both grain and stover. We're looking at changes in crop suitability and changes in cropping patterns as a result of that. In terms of the rangelands, we're looking at biomass production, so the quantity of the biomass, but also changes in species composition, which might then affect also the herbage quality. Now, obviously, both the production of stover and the production of biomass and the quality of biomass in the rangelands will have an impact on the animal component in our system. Of course, the animals are also directly influenced by climate change. For example, as temperatures rise, animals might experience heat stress, and that might have an impact on things like feed intake, animal growth and health, and also milk production and fertility levels. So we have both the direct effect and then, very importantly, also these indirect effects through the feed. Of course, there's also feedback loops from the animals to the crops and the grazing lands. And then we have some other factors that play a role, because as the climate changes, we will get some changes in our water resources that might have an impact on both the crop and the livestock again. And climate change will have an impact on pests, weeds, and diseases, but again, how that will play out is still very uncertain. We know that it will have an effect, but we really don't know how, where, and what, basically. Now, apart from effects of climate change on the system, we might also see system shifts, and that has been described very nicely in this paper by Jones and Thornton, where they showed that the zones here in red, they mapped the zones where the growing degree days might fall below 90 days. And so these areas, they might become less and less suitable for crop production, and they anticipate that livestock keeping will become more important in these areas. Now, when we look at our study site in Zimbabwe, I think we are right in the middle of that zone. Apart from that, seasonal migration may also become more important because, well, you all know livestock can move, and that's actually a big advantage because, like that, herders can take advantage of the spatial and the temporal variation in biomass availability, and that variation might become more pronounced with climate change. Then when it comes to extreme events, those can also have a very big impact on the livestock component. Droughts might be wiping out entire herds. That has been described many times. And the problem there is that unlike crops, it might really take years and years before livestock keepers are able to build up their herds again. And that is, of course, yeah, something we should probably try to take into account in our integrated assessments, but perhaps something that is not so easy to take into account. Okay, well, I wanted to also highlight this paper for those of you who are interested, because I think it's a very nice review of what we know and what we need to know in terms of the impacts of climate change on livestock and livestock systems, and in particular for developing countries. So I encourage you all to have a look at it if you don't know it. And you might say, well, this paper is already 5-6 years old. So perhaps we already know a lot more. Well, these slides, I've stolen them from Mark Howden from CSRO. He had a look at the latest IPCC report and compared the information in that report on cropping systems as compared to livestock. And the figures are quite remarkable. So here in the summary for policymakers, that is what SPM stands for, you see that actually livestock is just not mentioned at all. So that is quite remarkable. When we look at the food security chapter, we see that still there is a huge bias towards the crops. But at least livestock is at least mentioned a couple of times in the text, not in the figures. And then if we look at the regional chapters, we see that the picture starts to look a little bit better. Apart from Asia, so our colleagues from Asia, they have a big gap to fill there. When we look at the Africa chapter, it seems that there is a lot more information for on livestock, but I know for a fact that this information on livestock is really very qualitative and is more on, well, okay, we know that climate change might affect, for example, rangeland species composition and therefore herbage quality, but we really don't know how. Or we know that climate change will have an impact on water resources and therefore on livestock drinking points. But again, we have very little quantitative information on it, so it is still a lot of guesswork. And I think AgMIP can probably play an important role there in helping to fill those knowledge gaps. Okay, so we're about halfway through the webinar, and so it's time to move indeed to somewhat more concrete examples of the CLIP team, and I'll try to explain how we have included livestock issues in our analyses. So the CLIP project works in not only Zimbabwe but also in Malawi and Mozambique. And we had some work in South Africa in the first phase, but I don't think that will continue in the second phase. In terms of livestock, that was we looked at livestock only for Zimbabwe in the first phase because it was really a tryout. We really wanted to see, are we able to include livestock, and therefore we focused on Zimbabwe because that's where we had already quite some data available. And now in phase 2 we want to expand that to Mozambique and to Malawi as well. So we focus the rest of this presentation on the Inkai district in semi-arid Zimbabwe. It's located here in, I think it's zone 4 of the country. So it's semi-arid climate. Annual rainfall of about 450 to 650 millimeters coming with high seasonal variability. We have poor soil fertility in general, limited input use by the farmers, and as a result, poor crop and livestock productivity. The modeling framework then, so how did we include livestock into the different models that we use? Well, just as all the other regional teams, we had the climate data, which really came in to our analysis from, let's say, from the top. That's where it all starts. And the climate data is fed into the crop models. I've listed here AbSim only because that is, actually it was AbSim and DSAT, but this slide was taken from a presentation where we focused on the AbSim results. So that's why DSAT is left out. The results from the crop model were then fed into the livestock model, and we used LiveSim as a livestock model. And so basically here you can see that we only took the effects of climate change on crop production and therefore on crop residue production into account in our livestock model exercises. So we didn't, so far, we didn't include simulations of rangeland production and looked at the effects of those on livestock performance. So as it is mentioned here, we looked only at on-farm feed production through crop residues and forages, and looked at the effects on livestock production in terms of milk, offtake rates, and mortality rates. The outputs from the crop model and from the livestock model were fed into the economic model, just as the other teams did, but so this arrow is specific to our approach. And we did that for all the 160 households in our database, and therefore we could look at economic impacts on the heterogeneous populations. Now, what I should mention also is this: these are the 4 adaptation options that we compared. So the 0 N input is, let's say, our baseline scenario or our farmer practice. We compared then 2 different fertilizer rates for maize, 17 kilograms and 52 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And then we looked at a adaptation option which brought in mucuna into the rotation. And mucuna is a leguminous fodder crop. So it brings in nitrogen into the system, which is good for the other crops, but at the same time it also produces a high quality forage, which also we hypothesized that would have a positive impact also on the livestock. Okay, so let's have a look then at some of our data. What is important to mention is that we distinguished 3 different farm types, and those farm types are small, medium, and large farms. And importantly, with respect to livestock, we see that small farms almost have no livestock. They only keep some small ruminants and no cattle. The medium farms, they have about 6 tropical livestock units per farm, and the large farms, they have up to, let's say, 16 tropical livestock units per farm on average. Okay, and so they also have corresponding land areas, going from smaller to larger areas. Very quickly, some of the results from our climate analysis, just to mention here that we took 5 GCMs for more detailed analysis, in which K was a optimistic scenario and R was a pessimistic scenario in terms of rainfall. Then again, quite briefly, results from the crop simulations. Here you see the change in grain yield with climate change, and here the change in fodder production in terms of maize stover, again with climate change. So we see that with climate change there is a decrease in the maize crop residue production, and that will have an impact on the livestock because it means that there's a reduction in livestock feed quantity. These are then the adaptation options, and so we see when it comes to livestock feed that microdosing and recommended fertilizer rates lead to an increase in maize crop residue availability, and that the mucuna option also leads to a slight increase in maize crop residue availability. But of course, here we also got a lot of extra mucuna biomass, which was also fed to the livestock. let's have a look then at feed composition and feed gaps in the different scenarios. So this is what you would see if the animals were only grazing. So then you would have a huge feed gap here in these months before the rains start. Now, of course, in reality, farmers feed crop residues to their animals. So the feed gap is only really severe in the months of, let's say, October, November. And then with the recommended fertilizer, more crop residues are produced. So those are added here in the purple color. And then with the mucuna scenario, we see that we are not only adding biomass, but we are also adding biomass of higher quality, because mucuna is a forage crop that has a higher crude protein content and metabolizable energy content than the crop residues of the cereals. Here then we see some results of the climate change impact on the livestock productivity. For milk production, oh, I went too fast. For milk production, we see that there's hardly any change with in the future climates, and also actually for mortality rate, we see that they increase slightly as compared to the current climate, but really not that much. When we look at the adaptation options, however, we see that the fertilizer rates have an impact on increased milk production. We see that those increases are especially high for the recommended rate and for the option with mucuna. And then when it comes to mortality rates, we see that with the microdosing, we get a decrease in mortality rates, and that decrease is even stronger with the recommended fertilizer and with the mucuna option. Okay, now we brought that together in the integrated analysis, where we look at then the gainers and the losers from climate change. And here you see that so this thing is telling me that I should take a break. But so we see here for the different types of farmers that, especially in our pessimistic scenario, it is the people without livestock that would lose most from climate change. And but also in the other scenarios, we see some differences between the different types of farmers. We found, though, that the changes in per capita income are not so strong. I'm going a bit fast here because these are really the results from the TOA analysis, where all the different aspects were brought together. So this is not really livestock related, but I wanted to show you still this slide, where you see that the effects on poverty levels with and without adaptation, they're really nihil for the people without cattle. Whatever adaptation options these people adopted, they will remain below the poverty line. And those results were much better for the people who owned more cattle, where we see that the percentage of the farmers below the poverty line was reduced from about 60 to about 40%. Okay, that brings me then to a few slides on the rangeland simulation modeling, which was performed by Trinity. And Trinity shared her thesis with me, and I tried to really pick the main outcomes from there. So I hope I've done a good job, but if you have specific questions on this, I would recommend that you approach Trinity, and she will also be present at the Vic Falls workshop, so she will be able to provide more details on this work herself. And so Trinity looked at rangeland simulation modeling with the savanna model to have a look at how rangeland productivity varies in space and time, and what would be the effect of climate change. Let me jump immediately to the climate scenarios. She constructed some climate scenarios herself, so she didn't use the GCMs that we used in the integrated analysis. And those climate scenarios consisted of changes in rainfall, carbon dioxide, and temperature. One of the inputs to the model is a land use map. So here you see the land use map of the Nkai district, and then that land use map was then transformed into a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer grid landscape that looks a bit more coarse than the original one. But you see that we have forest, we have fields, we have degraded areas, and we have boreholes. Then when we look at the historical data sets, so that is with the current climate, we see that so the purple line is the rainfall, the blue line is the herbaceous vegetation layer. So we see that for the grasses, they follow the seasonal variation that is also present in the rainfall data. And the picture is quite different for the shrub and the woody vegetation, which do not show this strong year-to-year variation, but a more gradual increase. And I'll come to that later as well. And that increase, you can also see that reflected in a change in the cover of the woody layers in the tree and in the shrubs. So over time, from the 1980s to 2009, tree and shrub cover increases. These are then the results of the climate change scenarios, and you see here that, again, for the grasses, we mostly have year-to-year variations, and only at the end of the simulations after 30 years, we can distinguish some differences between the different climate scenarios. We see that actually there is less grass biomass with elevated CO2 concentrations. And that is related to the fact that for the tree and the shrub biomass, we get more biomass with the elevated CO2 concentrations. And that is, of course, related to the fact that the grasses are mostly C4 plants, and the shrubs and the trees are mostly C3 plants, which have a bigger advantage of the increases in CO2 concentration. So the main findings from these savanna simulations are that there is a big annual variation in grass biomass production because of the rainfall variability. Trinity found an increase in the woody component, and that as a result of that, we have a decrease in the carrying capacity of the land, and that is indeed a problem for livestock keepers. And yeah, because as you've seen, the increase in the woody component goes hand in hand with a decrease in the herbaceous component, and that is what animals like to graze, of course. And this increase in the wooding component is related both to grazing pressure and to climate change, and then mainly to the CO2 effect. Okay, so I have a few more slides to finish off, and then we still have a bit of time for questions. So a couple of achievements from phase 1 in the CLIP project is that we've managed to incorporate LiveSim, the livestock model, in a multi-model framework to simulate integrated effects of climate change and adaptation for entire household populations. And so this approach can now also be adopted by other teams in AgMIP. And then secondly, we've been able to do some savanna model simulations for the Nkai district in Zimbabwe. The main lessons are, first of all, that the LiveSim model is sensitive to feed input data, both quantity and quality, and therefore that we think the model is fit for climate impact assessments through feed effects. Secondly, that we found, and that is then more content related, that households with livestock are less vulnerable to climate change than the households that are focused only on crop production. thirdly, that alleviating feed gaps is an effective adaptation option, but that we only saw minor effects on poverty levels, and so that for the system in Zimbabwe, there is a need for more drastic adaptations and system transformation even. Now, the way forward in terms of the livestock modeling is to include more livestock-related adaptations, to also investigate historical variability, to analyze effects of extreme events, such as droughts, to try and link rangeland simulations with the savanna model and or with AbSim or DSAT simulating tropical grass productivity. So linking those rangeland simulations with livestock simulations, and then also trying to include a feedback from the livestock model outputs to the crop models via manure. And then perhaps more into the future, so I don't think this is work for phase 2, but perhaps for a phase 3 if that ever, if we ever start with that. And that would be to also include the more direct impacts of climate change on livestock, and in particular direct impacts of temperature, and then to also include simulations of small ruminants with ShowSim. So that is those are thoughts for the future. So with that, I've come to the end of my slides. So I hope Shari has been able to inventarize some questions, and I can also jump here to the chat box. Have there been any questions?
Katrine, this is Alex here. Can I ask a question on the phone?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So I'm sorry I only was able to jump in for the last half hour or so. But I wonder if I missed maybe some early things. A lot of people on the call may not be livestock experts, so could you help us with some basic vocabulary that you had? When you talk about offtake, what do you mean by that?
Okay. So offtake would be the animals that a household can sell on the market, let's say.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other term that I was curious about was tropical livestock unit. Is that something where a big animal counts as multiple units?
Okay, yeah, good one. So a tropical livestock unit is an animal of 250 kilograms. And so it's a way to, you know, to put all the animals on one heap and work with one unit. So you can count your different sizes of cows together with your sheep and your donkeys, and you can all express it in tropical livestock units.
I see. Great. And then I have a bunch of questions. I'll just run through them fast. The LiveSim model, it mostly is based on feed as opposed to direct heat stress. Is that correct?
Yeah. So heat stress is not a part of LiveSim. What we've been looking at is really effects on livestock of differences in the feed quantity and quality. Yeah. But you can also include differences between different breed types. So those things can be included, but heat stress is not part of LiveSim.
Is there anything like a statistical relationship we can apply on top, or is that just too much on the cutting edge of research?
I mean, those things we could discuss. I've discussed those things with the livestock people at the Gainesville meeting in when was it, in February or March this year, with Jean-François Susanna and colleagues, and they advised against it. They said, well, look, you've got so many uncertainties, and you've got animals roaming around in rangelands where they can go into the shade of trees, etc. So there are established relationships between livestock productivity and heat stress, but those relationships have been established for, you know, the more industrialized livestock systems, and so taking them from there and applying them on top of our model, I think is maybe not super meaningful.
Great. So that might be something that in the longer run we could write, that some more studies of true rangeland livestock heat stress effects would be helpful for phase 4. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly, for phase 4 or something. Yeah.
And then the last thing I just wanted to make as a comment was the core question 2, which is this new core question that we're going to focus on in AgMIP, which is looking at adaptation even in the current period. I think that will be very interesting because some of the things that you present here as adaptations may be just good practice if you can do it. It's not really climate change dependent.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah.
It would be interesting if we could kind of quantify that and highlight things that could be called no regrets, or things maybe we can identify some additional adaptations that will be particularly useful under climate change conditions.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree with that. Yeah.
Great.
Sure.
That's all for me. Thanks, Katrine.
Okay.
Katrine.
Okay, so there have been a couple of questions coming in now, eh?
Yep, there's one from Roberto. Do you see it?
Yeah, looking at LiveSim, which I think was heat stress on animals. Yes, we've discussed that, and so far we have decided to leave heat stress aside for the reason I just mentioned. But we can, I mean, I'm still open for another discussion on it. So maybe we should take it up at Vic Falls and have a discussion with a couple of people and then make a decision on what we do with it. Shall I go to the next question? In the interest of time, maybe more useful if data requirements for LiveSim are shared before 16 June webinar. Yeah, we can do that. I think you all have my email address. If not, it's my first name dot my last name at wur.nl. So perhaps that's easiest if you just write me an email and I can share the data requirements with you. And then a question from Irfan Baig, which is a private question, but I'll read it. Irfan from Pakistan, whether you have simulated the water availability with LiveSim along with feed. No, we have not. I'm not also sure how we would do that. You could think about water availability in terms of the distances that animals have to walk to get to drinking points. And so you could say, like, okay, let's assume that in a certain scenario there is lower water availability, hence animals will have to walk further, and therefore they will spend more energy on walking, and then perhaps they have they will lose weight or they will have lower milk production. So we could think of it in that sense, but water availability is not directly included in LiveSim as such. Okay, and then a question from Eric. Can you explain why farmers with livestock were more adaptive? Not sure if they were more adaptive. They were less vulnerable to climate change, at least to the pessimistic climate change scenario, and that is because the animals are less vulnerable to those climate change effects than the crops. So the people who only have crops, they face crop failures in certain years. And in those years, the people with animals, they can sort of compensate for these losses in the crop component with the animals that they keep. So I think that's at least my attempt in answering that question. Then Carolyn, has there been a characterization of what prevents those closer to the poverty line from adding livestock to their system, whether as individuals or as communities? Caroline, we didn't look at that in detail in our project, but there are studies on that. So people who are closer to the poverty line, they have less possibilities, less capital to invest in livestock. So, for example, for them to buy a cow would be really a big investment and a quite risky investment. So they are less likely to do that. Whereas they might invest in a small chicken or in a smaller goat or something. So that has been described, and there are papers on that in the literature as well. It's something we could also look at based on our data, but we haven't done that specifically. A question from Harbiel: could Livsim work with only stall-fed animals? Yes, that's a clear yes. What about the availability and training? So Livsim is freely available, and training, well, we will start in 2 weeks' time with a webinar, and we will help you guys with the model during the Fig Falls workshop. So yeah, I mean, and it's a model that runs in R. So basically, everybody who knows R can work with the model, and so I would encourage everybody to do a quick crash course on R. No, I'm joking a bit. We will help you guys with those things. Okay. Any other questions? So in 2 weeks' time, we will talk more about the technical details of the model. So some of these questions we will come back to them. Okay, well, then I think we are also close to closing time. So thanks everybody for attending, and thanks also for the interesting questions. And have a nice day.